The radio crackled with desperate static as Staff Sergeant Martinez pressed his back against the crumbling concrete wall, blood seeping through his tactical vest. Around him, 6 Navy SEALs, America's most elite warriors, were pinned down in what had become their tomb. The compound in eastern Afghanistan had been supposed to be a routine extraction. Intelligence had been wrong. Dead wrong. Bravo 6, this is Viper 1-1, Martinez whispered into his headset, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. We are surrounded. Repeat, we are surrounded. Enemy count approximately 40 tangos, RPGs confirmed. Request immediate air support. The silence that followed stretched like a held breath before the response came through layers of interference. Viper 1-1, this is Bravo 6. No assets available in your grid square. Hold position and wait for ground support. ETA unknown. Martinez closed his eyes. Around him, his brothers-in-arms were making peace with their maker. Petty Officer Chen was applying pressure to Johnson's leg wound, while Torres counted their remaining ammunition. 67 rounds between 7 men. The Taliban fighters beyond the walls knew they had them cornered, their voices growing bolder with each passing minute. "Sir," whispered Chen, his young face streaked with dust and desperation, "what are our orders?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the burning Humvee outside. Martinez had led these men through 3 tours, had brought them home to wives and children and futures. Now he was about to watch them die in a forgotten valley that wouldn't even make the evening news. The compound shook as another RPG exploded against the outer wall. Chunks of ancient brick rained down, and Martinez could hear the distinctive sound of AK-47s being chambered just beyond their position. The Taliban had learned patience from years of American occupation. They had time. The SEALs did not. That's when they heard it, a sound that didn't belong in their final moments. A low, angry growl cutting through the mountain air like a chainsaw through silk. Martinez pressed his ear to the wall, hardly daring to believe what his experience told him he was hearing. The distinctive whine of turbofan engines. The unmistakable voice of an A-10 Thunderbolt II. "Contact, contact," Torres hissed, pointing skyward. Friendly air approaching from the north. But intelligence had been clear. No air support was available. No A-10s were scheduled for this sector. So who was flying towards their position against direct orders, and why were they about to risk everything for 7 men the brass had already written off? The growl grew louder, and Martinez felt something he hadn't felt in hours. Hope. Above the ridge line, against the pale Afghan sky, a dark silhouette emerged like a guardian angel with wings of steel and a heart full of 30mm fury. The pilot inside that cockpit was either the bravest person alive or completely insane. Martinez was about to find out which. Lieutenant Colonel Ripley, Phoenix, Thorne had been flying combat missions for 12 years, but she'd never disobeyed a direct order quite this spectacularly. The radio in her cockpit crackled with increasingly angry transmissions from command, each one ordering her to abort and return to base immediately. She reached over and switched off her radio with the casual indifference of someone who had already decided her career was over. The A-10's twin engines hummed beneath her as she banked over the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, her eyes scanning the valley below through her helmet-mounted display. Smoke rose from multiple positions, and she could see the distinct heat signatures of the surrounded American forces through her targeting pod. 7 men who were about to become another tragic footnote in America's longest war, unless she did something about it. Phoenix wasn't a call sign she'd chosen for herself. It had been given to her after she'd survived a surface-to-air missile hit over Iraq 3 years ago, somehow managing to land her damaged A-10 on a highway and walk away with nothing but bruised ribs and wounded pride. The maintenance chief who'd looked at her aircraft afterward had shaken his head in amazement. "Ma'am, this bird should have been ash and scrap metal. You rose from the dead out there." The name had stuck, though Ripley had always suspected it was as much about her habit of rising from the dead ends of her military career as her miraculous survival. She'd grown up in rural Montana, the daughter of a crop duster who taught her to fly before she could legally drive. Her father had been skeptical when she'd announced her intention to join the Air Force, not because she was a woman, but because he'd seen too many good pilots destroyed by military bureaucracy. "Flying's about instinct, Ripley," he'd told her the night before she left for the academy. "Don't let them turn you into a robot who follows orders without thinking." Now, as she lined up for her attack run, she realized she was finally taking his advice. The compound below was a textbook close air support scenario: friendly forces pinned down, clear target identification, and enough ordnance on her aircraft to turn the tide. The only problem was that officially, she wasn't supposed to be here. Ripley had been returning from a training mission when she'd monitored the distress call on the emergency frequency. Command's response had been immediate and absolute. No air support available, ground forces were on their own. Something about the resignation in that radio operator's voice had made her stomach clench. She'd been that voice before, telling good people they were about to die alone. She armed her GIU-8 Avenger cannon and began her descent into hell. The Taliban fighters below had no idea what was coming. They'd grown comfortable in their siege mentality, confident that time was on their side. They'd spotted the American aircraft circling high above, but their experience told them it was either conducting reconnaissance or would soon leave when no ground support materialized. They were wrong on both counts. Ripley's first pass was a masterpiece of precision violence. The A-10's cannon roared to life with a sound like the world being torn in half, sending 3,900 rounds per minute of depleted uranium death into the enemy positions. The ancient compound walls that had sheltered Taliban fighters for generations exploded in clouds of dust and blood as the 30-millimeter rounds found their targets. Inside the compound, Martinez and his men felt the earth shake as the A-10 screamed overhead, barely 50 feet above their position. The sound was so close and so violent that Johnson, despite his leg wound, managed a weak smile. "Was that what I think it was?" he whispered. Martinez keyed his radio on the emergency frequency, hopping against hope that the pilot could hear him. "Unknown aircraft, this is Viper 11. Please identify yourself and current station." The response came immediately, and Martinez was surprised to hear a distinctly female voice cutting through the static with the kind of calm professionalism that spoke of years in combat. "Viper 11, this is Phoenix. I'm your close air support for today. Mark your position with smoke and keep your heads down. I've got 30 minutes of fuel and enough ordnance to ruin somebody's day." There was something in that voice, not just competence, but a kind of quiet fury that made Martinez believe they might actually survive this. The Taliban fighters were regrouping, but their confidence had been shattered by the first gun run. Several of their positions had been completely destroyed, and the survivors were beginning to understand that they were now the ones being hunted. As Ripley banked around for her second attack, she could see the enemy fighters scrambling for new cover. This was the chess match she lived for, the deadly dance between hunter and hunted that separated the professionals from the pretenders. She'd spent years perfecting her skills in this ancient game of three-dimensional warfare, and today 7 American lives depended on her expertise. The second pass targeted the enemy's heavy weapons positions. Ripley had identified 2 RPG teams and what appeared to be a mortar crew through her targeting systems. The A-10's precision was legendary, and she intended to demonstrate exactly why the aircraft had earned the nickname Warthog: ugly, tough, and absolutely lethal when it mattered most. The mortar position disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris as her cannon rounds walked across the target area. The Taliban fighters were learning what American ground forces had known for decades. When the A-10 arrived overhead, the situation was about to change dramatically. Martinez watched through a crack in the wall as the enemy positions were systematically destroyed by the circling aircraft. Whoever Phoenix was, she was rewriting the tactical situation with surgical precision. But he could also see that the Taliban weren't giving up. They were adapting, moving to new positions and preparing for what they knew would be a ground assault once the A-10 ran low on ammunition. "Phoenix, this is Viper 1-1, Martinez called on the radio. "Beautiful work up there. What's your fuel and ammunition status?" The response came back immediately, and he could hear the strain in the pilot's voice despite her professional demeanor. "Viper 1-1, Phoenix. I've got maybe 20 minutes of fuel and 2 more gun runs before I'm Winchester. You need to be ready to move when I create an opening." Martinez looked around at his wounded men and felt his stomach tighten. Moving meant exposing themselves, and Johnson could barely walk with his leg wound. But staying meant dying when Phoenix ran out of ammunition. The radio crackled again, and this time Phoenix's voice carried a different tone, something personal and determined that cut through the tactical chatter. "Viper 1-1, I didn't fly into a shit storm just to watch you die in that compound. When I make my next run, you move to the northwest corner and wait for extraction. Ground support is en route, ETA 15 minutes. Martinez wanted to ask how she knew about ground support when command had told him none was available, but there wasn't time for questions. As Phoenix lined up for her third attack run, she was thinking about the 7 men below and the impossible mathematics of combat aviation. She had enough fuel for maybe one more pass after this one, and her ammunition was running dangerously low. Once she left station, those SEALs would be on their own until ground support arrived, if it actually was en route. The third pass was different. Instead of targeting individual positions, Ripley used her remaining ordnance to create a corridor of destruction leading from the compound to the northwest extraction point. The A-10's cannon carved a path through enemy positions like a fiery plow, giving the trapped SEALs their first real chance at survival in hours. "Move, move, move," Martinez shouted as Phoenix's cannon fire walked across the battlefield. Torres and Chen lifted Johnson between them, while the rest of the team provided covering fire. The run to the extraction point felt like miles, but it was actually less than 200 meters of broken ground and scattered Taliban bodies. They made it to the northwest corner just as Phoenix's A-10 disappeared over the eastern ridge, her fuel finally reaching critical levels. The sudden absence of her protective presence felt like being abandoned by a guardian angel, but Martinez could already hear the distinctive whine of approaching helicopters in the distance. The extraction was textbook perfect, 2 Black Hawks appearing over the northern ridgeline with door gunners already engaging scattered enemy positions. Within minutes, all 7 SEALs were aboard and airborne, Martinez taking one last look at the compound that had nearly become their grave. Through his headset, he heard the helicopter pilot talking to someone on a different frequency. "Phoenix, this is Rescue 17. Package is secure and en route to base. Outstanding work out there." The response came through clearly, and Martinez realized he was finally going to learn something about the pilot who had saved their lives. "Rescue 17, Phoenix. Glad I could help. Tell those SEALs they owe me a beer." There was a pause, and then her voice returned with something that sounded almost like vulnerability. "Phoenix is RTB fuel critical. See you back at the barn." As the Black Hawks carried them toward safety, Martinez found himself wondering about the woman behind the call sign. Who was Phoenix, and why had she risked her career and her life for 7 men she'd never met? The questions would haunt him for the rest of his life, but right now he was just grateful to be alive to ask them. Lieutenant Colonel Ripley Thorne was in serious trouble, and she knew it. The moment she landed her A-10 at Bagram Airfield, she could see the reception committee waiting for her, 2 Air Force security police vehicles, a staff car with colonel's plates, and enough brass to start their own army. She shut down her engines and sat in the cockpit for a moment, watching the ground crew approach with the kind of careful distance usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Williams, climbed the ladder to her cockpit with an expression that mixed relief and terror. "Ma'am, Colonel Hendricks wants to see you in his office immediately," And I mean immediately. Williams had been working on A-10s for 15 years, and he'd never seen a pilot return from an unauthorized combat mission to this kind of reception. Ripley climbed down from her aircraft and surveyed the damage from her hasty departure. Her A-10 showed the typical wear of a combat mission: carbon scoring around the gun port, empty ammunition bays, and the particular kind of fatigue that came from pushing a machine to its operational limits. She'd brought 7 men home alive, but the cost was going to be her career. Colonel Hendricks' office felt like a courtroom when she walked in 20 minutes later. The wing commander sat behind his desk with the kind of cold fury that spoke of years managing subordinates who thought they were above military law. Beside him stood Major General Roberts from Air Combat Command, whose presence meant this incident had already climbed the chain of command to levels that could end careers with a signature. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne, Hendricks began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, do you have any idea what you've done? It wasn't really a question, and Ripley knew better than to answer. She stood at attention and waited for the storm to break over her head. You disobeyed a direct order from air traffic control. You engaged enemy forces without authorization. You expended government ammunition on an unauthorized mission. You put a $40 million aircraft at risk for no tactical gain. Hendricks was reading from a list, and Ripley realized that her actions had already been reduced to a series of administrative charges. General Roberts stepped forward, and his expression was unreadable. Colonel Thorne, explain to me why I shouldn't have you court-martialed and thrown out of my Air Force. The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, and Ripley realized this was the moment that would define the rest of her life. She'd rehearsed this moment during the flight back to base, but standing in front of 2 senior officers who held her future in their hands, the words felt inadequate. Sir, 7 American servicemen were about to die. I had the capability to prevent that outcome, and I acted. It sounded simple when she said it, but they all knew the implications were anything but simple. Those 7 men were told explicitly that no air support was available, Hendricks continued. Command made a tactical decision based on available resources and competing priorities. You don't get to second-guess theater-level decisions because you have a hero complex. The accusation stung because there was truth in it. Ripley had always struggled with the bureaucratic side of military service. General Roberts walked to the window and stared out at the flight line, where A-10s were being prepared for scheduled missions. Colonel Thorne, what you did today was either the most heroic act I've seen in 25 years of service, or the most reckless. The problem is, I can't tell which. He turned back to face her, and she could see him weighing the competing demands of military discipline and tactical necessity. The intercom on Hendricks' desk buzzed, and his secretary's voice filled the room. Sir, there's a call for you on line 3. It's Sergeant Martinez from the rescued SEAL team. He says it's urgent. The timing seemed impossible, but Ripley felt a flicker of hope as Hendricks reached for the phone. The conversation was brief and one-sided from their perspective, but Ripley could see Hendricks' expression changing as he listened to whatever Martinez was telling him. After 5 minutes, he hung up the phone and exchanged a long look with General Roberts. It seems, Hendricks said slowly, that there's more to this story than we initially understood. The debriefing room at Bagram felt like a confessional as Ripley sat across from 2 intelligence officers and a JAG lawyer. The initial fury from her commanders had been replaced by something more complex, a mixture of administrative frustration and genuine curiosity about what had actually happened in the valley that morning. Major Susan Chen from Air Force Intelligence had spread a collection of photographs and radio transcripts across the table, each one representing a piece of the puzzle that was beginning to emerge. Colonel Thorne, we need to understand your decision-making process during the incident. Walk us through what you observed and how you assessed the tactical situation. Ripley had been through enough post-mission briefings to know this was more than routine administrative cleanup. The intelligence officer's questions were too specific, too focused on details that went beyond simple rule-breaking. Something about her unauthorized mission had attracted attention from levels of command she'd never imagined. I monitored the distress call on emergency frequencies during my return from a training mission, Ripley began, choosing her words carefully. Viper 11 reported they were surrounded and requested immediate air support. Command responded that no assets were available. She paused, remembering the resignation in that radio operator's voice. Something about the tactical situation seemed wrong to me. Major Chen leaned forward, her expression intense. Wrong how, Colonel? What specifically made you question the decision to deny air support? The question carried implications that Ripley was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just about her rule-breaking. There were larger issues at play. The timeline didn't make sense, Ripley continued. 7 SEALs don't get pinned down in a routine extraction without significant intelligence failures. Either we completely misunderstood the enemy presence in that sector, or someone wanted those men to fail. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and she could see the intelligence officers exchanging glances. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes from the JAG office had been taking notes throughout the interview, but now he set down his pen and studied Ripley with the kind of attention lawyers reserved for witnesses who might change everything. Colonel Thorne, are you suggesting that the denial of air support was deliberate? That someone wanted American servicemen to die? The question forced Ripley to confront implications she'd been avoiding since landing her aircraft. Her unauthorized mission hadn't just saved 7 lives. It had potentially exposed something much larger and more dangerous than simple bureaucratic incompetence. I'm suggesting that when American forces request emergency support, and we have the capability to provide it, denying that support requires justification that goes beyond resource allocation, she said carefully. 7 men with decades of special operations experience don't get trapped unless someone made significant errors in planning or intelligence. Major Chen gathered the photographs and transcripts, her expression thoughtful. Colonel Thorne, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the secret level. The compound where Viper 11 was trapped wasn't their original target. They were diverted from their planned extraction route by updated intelligence that we now believe was deliberately falsified. The revelation hit Ripley like a physical blow. She'd stumbled into the middle of something that went far beyond her unauthorized combat mission. Someone with access to operational intelligence had deliberately misdirected a SEAL team into a trap, and her decision to disobey orders had accidentally prevented what might have been a carefully planned massacre. Who had access to the intelligence that was modified? Ripley asked, her pilot's instincts already calculating the implications. If someone with high-level clearance was working against American forces, every mission in theater was potentially compromised. That's what we're trying to determine, Major Chen replied. Your actions today didn't just save 7 lives, Colonel. They may have exposed a security breach that goes to the highest levels of command. We need you to tell us everything you remember about the communications you monitored, every detail that might help us identify who's responsible. As Ripley began reconstructing every radio transmission and tactical detail from her unauthorized mission, she realized her career wasn't over. It was just beginning. The woman who'd risked everything to save 7 strangers was about to become the key witness in an investigation that would shake the foundations of American military command. The classified briefing room 3 levels beneath Bagram Airfield felt like something from a spy novel, as Ripley found herself sitting across from officials she'd only seen in classified intelligence briefings. Deputy Director Harrison from the CIA, Brigadier General Walsh from Defense Intelligence Agency, and Colonel Matthews from Air Force Special Investigations had flown in specifically to debrief her about what was now being called the Phoenix Incident. Colonel Thorne, Deputy Director Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of decades in intelligence work. Your unauthorized mission inadvertently interrupted what we now believe was a carefully orchestrated operation to eliminate Viper 11's SEAL team. We need you to help us understand how deep this conspiracy goes." The word conspiracy hung in the air like smoke from a burning building. Ripley had grown up believing in the fundamental integrity of American military command, but the evidence being presented suggested that trust had been misplaced. Someone with access to the highest levels of intelligence had been systematically compromising operations, and her decision to disobey orders had accidentally exposed them. Brigadier General Walsh spread a series of classified documents across the table, each one marked with security classifications that made Ripley's eyes water. "What we're about to show you represents 2 years of investigation into systematic intelligence failures that have cost American lives. Your actions yesterday provided the final piece of evidence we needed to identify the source." The documents painted a picture of calculated betrayal that went far beyond simple incompetence. Over the past 18 months, 7 special operations missions had been compromised by updated intelligence that led American forces into carefully prepared ambushes. The Phoenix incident was supposed to be the 8th, but Ripley's intervention had saved not just 7 lives, it had provided the evidence needed to expose the pattern. "Colonel Matthews," Harrison continued, "show her the communication intercepts from yesterday's mission." The Air Force investigator activated a secure laptop and displayed a series of radio transmissions that made Ripley's blood run cold. The intercepts showed that someone with access to real-time operational intelligence had been feeding information directly to Taliban commanders. The compound where Viper 11 had been trapped wasn't randomly chosen. It had been specifically selected because it provided maximum tactical advantage for an ambush while appearing to be a routine extraction point. "Jesus Christ," Ripley whispered, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. "How long has this been going on? How many people have died because of this?" The questions came out in a rush, and she could see her own horror reflected in the faces of the intelligence officials. "We estimate at least 47 American casualties over the past 2 years, General Walsh replied quietly. "Your decision to disobey orders didn't just save Viper 11, it gave us the evidence we needed to stop a systematic betrayal of American forces." The weight of those 47 lives settled on Ripley's shoulders like lead blankets. Deputy Director Harrison leaned forward, his expression intense. "Colonel Thorne, we need you to understand something. The person responsible for these intelligence leaks is someone you know. Someone who had access to your flight schedule and knew you'd be returning from training when Viper 11 called for support. This wasn't random, it was personal." The revelation that someone she knew personally had been responsible for American deaths made Ripley feel physically sick. She'd spent 12 years building relationships within the military community, trusting colleagues with her life on a daily basis. The idea that one of those relationships had been built on systematic betrayal was almost impossible to process. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The intelligence officials exchanged glances, and she realized they were about to name someone whose betrayal would haunt her for the rest of her life. Colonel Matthews turned the laptop screen toward her, and Ripley found herself staring at a photograph that made her world collapse. The image showed Colonel James Morrison, her former squadron commander, and the man who had recommended her for promotion to lieutenant colonel. Morrison had been her mentor, her advocate, and her friend for 8 years. "Colonel Morrison has been feeding operational intelligence to Taliban commanders since 2019, Harrison said quietly. "He's responsible for every compromised mission, every American death, and yesterday's attempt to eliminate Viper 11. Your unauthorized intervention disrupted his plans and provided us with the evidence we needed for arrest." Ripley stared at Morrison's photograph and felt something inside her break. The man who had taught her advanced combat tactics, who had written her fitness reports, who had been like a father to her professionally, had been systematically murdering American servicemen for 3 years. The betrayal was so profound that she couldn't process it emotionally. "Why?" she asked, the word coming out like a physical pain. "Why would he do this? What could possibly justify murdering his own people?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and she could see the intelligence officials struggling with their own need to understand Morrison's motivations. "Money," General Walsh replied simply. "He's been receiving approximately $50,000 per compromised mission from Taliban sources. In 3 years, he's made over $400,000 by selling American lives." The clinical nature of the explanation somehow made it worse. Morrison hadn't been driven by ideology or political conviction, just simple greed. As the briefing continued, Ripley learned that Morrison's arrest was being coordinated to coincide with a broader operation to roll up the Taliban intelligence network he'd been feeding. Her unauthorized mission had not only saved 7 lives, it had provided the final evidence needed to expose a conspiracy that went far beyond one corrupt officer. "Colonel Thorne," Deputy Director Harrison said as the briefing concluded, "your actions yesterday represent everything that's right about American military service. You risked your career to save lives, and in doing so, you exposed a betrayal that would have continued killing Americans for years to come. Your country owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." But as Ripley left the briefing room and emerged into the harsh Afghan sunlight, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman whose trust in the fundamental decency of her military family had been shattered by someone she'd loved like a father. The 7 men she'd saved were alive, but the cost of that salvation was higher than she'd ever imagined. The arrest of Colonel Morrison sent shockwaves through the entire theater of operations, as word spread through the military community that one of their most respected officers had been systematically betraying American forces. Ripley watched from her quarters as military police vehicles surrounded Morrison's housing unit, knowing that a man she'd trusted with her life was about to be charged with treason and multiple counts of murder. She'd been placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation, which meant she had nothing to do but contemplate the implications of what her unauthorized mission had uncovered. The 7 SEALs she'd saved were being debriefed by various intelligence agencies, and she wondered if they understood that their near-death experience had been orchestrated by someone wearing the same uniform they'd sworn to honor. Technical Sergeant Williams found her in the base chapel that evening, staring at a simple wooden cross that represented everything she'd believed about duty, honor, and sacrifice. Her crew chief had worked with her for 3 years, and he could read her moods better than most people could read books. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the word around the flight line is that you're some kind of hero. They're saying you exposed a traitor and saved a bunch of lives." He paused, studying her face in the dim light of the chapel. "But you don't look like someone who feels heroic." Ripley managed a weak smile. "Williams, did you ever have someone you trusted completely betray that trust in the worst possible way?" The question was rhetorical, but she could see understanding in her crew chief's eyes. Military families were built on trust, and when that trust was violated, the damage went far beyond the immediate victims. "Colonel Morrison was like a father to me," she continued. "He taught me everything I know about combat flying. He recommended me for promotion. He was the reason I stayed in the Air Force when I was thinking about getting out." The words came out like a confession, and she realized she was grieving not just for Morrison's betrayal, but for the loss of her faith in military leadership. Williams sat beside her on the chapel pew, his expression thoughtful. "Ma'am, with all due respect, maybe that's why you were the one who caught him. You knew him well enough to recognize when something wasn't right. Someone who didn't trust him wouldn't have been in position to stop what he was doing." The observation was surprisingly insightful, and Ripley realized her crew chief had identified something she'd been struggling to understand. Her unauthorized mission hadn't been just about saving 7 lives. It had been about trusting her instincts when official channels had failed. Morrison's betrayal had made those instincts necessary. "The SEALs want to meet you," Williams continued. "Sergeant Martinez has been asking around the base, trying to find out who Phoenix is. Word is they want to thank you personally." The idea of meeting the men she'd saved filled Ripley with a mixture of pride and anxiety. "What did you say to people whose lives you'd saved by accident?" "Williams, do you think I did the right thing?" she asked, finally voicing the question that had been haunting her since landing her A-10. "I disobeyed direct orders. I put government property at risk. I could have been court-martialed and thrown out of the service." The doubts had been eating at her for days, and she needed to hear from someone she trusted. Her crew chief was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Ma'am, I've been working on combat aircraft for 15 years. I've seen pilots who follow orders without thinking, and I've seen pilots who think without following orders. The best ones, the ones who win wars and bring people home, they know when to do both." He paused, looking at the cross above the altar. "You brought 7 men home alive and exposed a traitor who was killing Americans. In my book, that makes you exactly the kind of officer this country needs." As they sat in the chapel's quiet peace, Ripley began to understand that her unauthorized mission had been about more than just tactical decisions. It had been about the fundamental values that made military service meaningful. Sometimes doing the right thing required breaking the rules, and sometimes breaking the rules was the most honorable thing a person could do. The next morning, she would meet the 7 men whose lives she'd saved, and begin to understand the true cost of her decision to trust her instincts over official orders. The meeting with Viper 11 took place in a secure conference room at Bagram's Special Operations Compound, and Ripley found herself more nervous than she'd been before her first combat mission. These weren't just statistics or tactical objectives. They were 7 men who'd looked death in the face and lived because she decided to disobey orders. Staff Sergeant Martinez was smaller than she'd expected, but his eyes carried the kind of intensity that came from years of combat leadership. When she walked into the room, all 7 SEALs stood at attention, and she realized they were treating her with the kind of respect usually reserved for senior officers who'd earned their reverence through decades of service. "Phoenix," Martinez said, his voice carrying emotions he was struggling to control. "We've been trying to figure out how to thank someone who saved our lives by breaking every rule in the book." He paused, looking around at his teammates. "We finally decided the only appropriate response was to tell you what your actions meant to each of us personally." What followed was one of the most emotionally difficult hours of Ripley's military career. Each SEAL took turns describing what they'd been thinking during those final moments in the compound. Thoughts of wives and children they'd never see again, letters they'd never write, dreams they'd never fulfill. They spoke about the sound of her A-10's cannon as a voice from heaven, and her radio transmissions as the words that had given them hope when hope was impossible. Petty Officer Chen, the youngest member of the team, spoke about his daughter's 2nd birthday, which he would have missed permanently if not for Ripley's intervention. Torres described his wife's pregnancy and the son he would never have met. Johnson, still recovering from his leg wound, talked about his plans to propose to his girlfriend when he returned from deployment, plans that had seemed meaningless until Phoenix's arrival had made them possible again. "Ma'am," Martinez concluded, "we know you risked your career and possibly your freedom to save 7 people you'd never met. That kind of courage and selflessness represents everything we believe military service should be about." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. "We wanted you to have something that would remind you of what you accomplished." Ripley unwrapped the cloth to reveal a military challenge coin unlike anything she'd ever seen. It had been handcrafted from the metal of an expended 30mm shell casing, one of the rounds she'd fired during her gun runs. On one side was engraved the A-10 silhouette with Phoenix inscribed below it. On the other side were 7 names and a simple inscription: 7 lives, 1 decision, forever grateful. "We had it made from one of your shell casings that we found at the compound," Torres explained. Every time you look at it, remember that 7 American families got to keep their husbands, fathers, and sons because you chose courage over caution. The gift was more meaningful than any medal or commendation she'd ever received, representing not just official recognition, but genuine gratitude from the men whose lives she'd saved. As the meeting concluded, Martinez asked her a question that would haunt her for years to come. "Phoenix, what made you decide to disobey orders and come help us? Command was clear that no support was available, and you had every reason to believe your career was over if you intervened." Ripley thought about the question for a long moment, trying to articulate something that was more instinct than rational decision-making. "Sergeant, I've been flying combat missions for 12 years, and I've learned that sometimes the most important orders are the ones nobody gives you. When I heard the resignation in that radio operator's voice, the assumption that you were already dead, something inside me rebelled against accepting that outcome." She paused, looking around at the 7 faces that represented families that would remain intact because of her decision. "I became a military pilot because I believe in protecting people who can't protect themselves. Yesterday, you couldn't protect yourselves, and I had the capability to change that. Everything else was just bureaucratic noise." As she left the meeting and walked across the flight line toward her quarters, Ripley realized that her understanding of military service had fundamentally changed. The rules and regulations that governed military life were important, but they were ultimately just tools to serve a higher purpose. When those tools failed to serve that purpose, exceptional circumstances required exceptional responses. Her unauthorized mission had saved 7 lives and exposed a conspiracy that had cost dozens of American deaths. But more importantly,